When billionaire James Harrison spots his maid's daughter sleeping on a cold city street, he stops his car, unaware that saving her would uncover a past he spent decades burying. He almost didn't stop the car. Just another night. Just another lost soul. But then, her hair. Blonde, tangled, too familiar. "Stop the car," he said. The billionaire stepped into the cold night and found his housekeeper's daughter asleep on a bus stop bench. Alone. Frightened. Waiting for a mother who never came home. In that instant, the walls of his fortune cracked, letting the cold truth rush in. This is the story of how a man who had everything met a little girl who reminded him of the one thing he'd lost, his humanity. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. A legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you build in others. The old man saw the girl's small form curled on the cold metal bench, a splash of blonde hair under the dim street lamp. He almost kept driving, but a flicker of something familiar in her posture made his heart ache with a memory he had long since buried. The November air had a bite that promised a bitter winter. It seeped through the insulated windows of the Rolls-Royce, carrying the scent of rain and cold asphalt. James Harrison watched the city lights blur past, a smear of gold and red against the wet darkness. At 75, he had come to see the world through thick, soundproof glass. It was quieter that way. Safer. His driver, a silent man named Michael who had been with him for 20 years, navigated the slick streets with practiced ease. They were on their way back to the penthouse, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel that overlooked the sprawling metropolis. It was a place James called home, though it had never truly felt like one. As they turned onto a quieter side street, a block from his building, the headlights swept across a bus stop. A lone figure was huddled on the bench. It was late, well past midnight. Most of the city's forgotten souls had already found their corners for the night. James's first instinct was to look away. He had trained himself to do so over 5 decades of accumulating wealth. Looking too closely meant feeling, and feeling was a complication his meticulously ordered life could not afford. But he didn't look away. Not this time. There was something about the smallness of the figure, the way a worn, oversized jacket swallowed the frame. And the hair, a cascade of bright blonde, even in the murky light. It reminded him of his sister, decades ago, before life had pulled them apart. "Stop the car," James said. His voice was raspy and used for most of the evening. Michael glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Sir." "Stop the car," James repeated, his gaze fixed on the bench. The Rolls-Royce glided to a silent halt beside the curb. James pressed the button to lower his window, and the city's raw breath filled the car, the smell of exhaust, damp pavement, and distant sirens. The girl didn't stir. She was sleeping, her head pillowed on a tattered backpack, her small hands tucked inside her sleeves for warmth. She couldn't have been more than 10. A cold knot tightened in James's stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a potent mix of anger and a sorrow, so deep it felt like a personal failure. What was a child doing out here alone? He opened his door before Michael could assist him. The cold hit him instantly, a shock to his system. He walked slowly toward the bench, his expensive leather shoes making soft sounds on the wet sidewalk. As he drew closer, his breath caught. He knew this child. He had seen her only in passing, a shy, fleeting presence in the service hallways of his own home. This was Abigail, the daughter of his housekeeper, Eleanor. Eleanor, a woman who moved through his penthouse with quiet efficiency, always with a polite nod, her eyes downcast. She was a good worker, reliable, invisible. He had never given her life a second thought. He paid her well, and that, he had always believed, was enough. Now, seeing her daughter sleeping on a bus stop bench, he understood how wrong he had been. "Abigail," he said softly. The girl's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling blue, wide with confusion and then a flicker of fear. She scrambled to sit up, clutching her backpack to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Harrison?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He recognized the name, of course. She knew who he was. But the way she said it, not with awe, but with the quiet formality of a servant's child, sent a fresh pang of something sharp through him. "Yes, it's me," he said, his tone softer than he intended. "What are you doing out here, child? Where is your mother?" Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, and her small chin began to quiver. I don't know, she confessed, the words choked with a sob she was fighting to hold back. She was supposed to be home hours ago. She didn't come. James looked from the crying child to the dark, indifferent street. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, mastering the art of the deal, insulating himself from the world's messy, inconvenient emotions. But in that moment, standing in the cold rain before a lost little girl, none of it mattered. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble. He took off his heavy wool overcoat, the fabric still warm from the car. He draped it over her small, shivering shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves dangling past her hands. "Come on," he said, his voice now firm but not unkind. "You're coming with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He gently helped her to her feet and guided her toward the waiting car. Michael, ever the professional, had the back door open, his face a mask of polite neutrality, though James saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. As Abigail slid onto the plush leather seat, she looked impossibly small, a forgotten doll in a cavernous, opulent world. She clutched her backpack, her knuckles white. James settled in beside her, the silence in the car now filled with a new, profound weight. "Michael, take us home," he said. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the empty bench behind, James Harrison looked at the little girl beside him. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her blonde hair matted from the damp. He saw not just a child in need, but a reflection of a world he had chosen to ignore. A world where mothers went missing and their daughters were left to sleep on the streets. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not look away. Not anymore. The journey to the penthouse was short, but the silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Abigail stared out the window, her small face reflected in the glass as the city's lights streaked by. She hadn't said another word since getting into the car. She simply sat, wrapped in a coat that smelled of old leather and expensive cologne, a scent so foreign it was like being on another planet. When they arrived at the towering residential skyscraper, the doorman, a stout man named George, rushed forward to open the door, his face a mixture of surprise and curiosity as he saw the small, disheveled child emerging from Mr. Harrison's car. James gave him a look that permitted no questions. "Good evening, George," was all he said, gently guiding Abigail through the gleaming marble lobby. They rode the private elevator up to the penthouse in silence. The ascent was fast and smooth, a silent climb to the top of the world. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, Abigail's eyes widened. She had been here before, but only in the back corridors, the kitchen, the laundry room, the unseen parts of the vast, empty space. She had never seen the main living area. It was a cavern of glass and white furniture, with a view that stretched across the entire city. The lights of millions of people twinkled below like a fallen constellation. To a 10-year-old, it looked like the inside of a spaceship. "Are you hungry?" James asked, breaking the silence. Abigail shook her head, still clutching her backpack. She looked overwhelmed, a small boat tossed into a vast, indifferent ocean. James sighed. He was not good with children. He had no children of his own, a choice made long ago in favor of his career. He felt a clumsy awkwardness, a helplessness that was entirely foreign to him. What did a lost child need? Warmth, safety, food. He could provide those things. But what she really needed was her mother. "Let's get you something warm to drink," he decided. "Hot chocolate." A small nod. That was a start. He led her into the kitchen, a space of stainless steel and black granite that was more of a showroom than a functional room. His housekeeper, Eleanor, was the only one who ever used it. James himself hadn't made so much as a piece of toast in over 30 years. He opened the refrigerator, a vast, mostly empty cavern, and found a carton of milk. He fumbled through the pantry, a closet filled with gourmet items he'd never touched, until he found a tin of cocoa powder. As he heated the milk on the state-of-the-art induction stove, he felt Abigail's eyes on him. He glanced over his shoulder. She was standing by the kitchen island, watching his clumsy efforts with a solemn curiosity. "My mom uses a little bit of vanilla," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She says it makes it taste like a hug." James paused. A hug. He found a small bottle of vanilla extract and added a single drop to the steaming milk. He poured the chocolate into a heavy ceramic mug and placed it on the island in front of her. "Thank you," she mumbled, wrapping her small, cold hands around its warmth. She took a tentative sip. A faint smile touched her lips. It tastes right. James pulled up a stool and sat opposite her. The vast, silent kitchen seemed to shrink around them. For the first time, he took a proper look at her. She had her mother's determined chin, but her eyes were a different shade of blue, brighter and more observant than he had realized. In them, he saw not just fear, but a resilience that was both heartbreaking and admirable. "Abigail," he began gently, "I need you to tell me everything. When was the last time you saw your mother?" She looked down into her mug. "This morning. She left for her first job. She works at the diner on 6th Street before she comes here. She always comes home at 6. She makes me dinner, helps me with my homework, and then she leaves for her night job." James frowned. "Night job? I didn't know she had a third job." Abigail nodded. "She cleans offices downtown. She gets home very late, after I'm asleep. But she's always there in the morning. Always." Her voice broke on the last word. "Tonight, she never came home from her shift here. I waited and waited. The landlord locked the lobby door at 10. I didn't have a key to our apartment, so I couldn't get in." The story tumbled out of her, a simple, devastating narrative of a life lived on the margins. Their apartment was a single room in a building 2 miles away. The landlord was a difficult man. Her mother worked 3 jobs, a relentless cycle of cleaning up after other people, just to keep their heads above water. "So you walked to the bus stop?" James asked, his voice tight. "I thought I would wait for her there," she explained. "She takes that bus to her night job. I thought I would see her, but I got so tired. I think I fell asleep." James felt that cold knot in his stomach twist again, tighter this time. He had paid Eleanor a generous salary, or so he had thought. He had assumed it was enough. He never considered the cost of living in this city, the rent, the food, the endless, crushing expenses that could swallow a person whole. He had never considered that his generous salary was just one small piece of a desperate puzzle her mother was trying to solve every single day. He thought of the file his HR department kept on his household staff. It contained their names, social security numbers, and addresses. Nothing more. He had never asked where Eleanor lived. He had never asked about her husband, her family, or her struggles. He had never asked about the little girl who was now sitting in his kitchen, a refugee from a world of poverty he had only ever observed from his penthouse window. "We are going to find her," James said, the words feeling like a vow. He wasn't just speaking to the child. He was speaking to himself. "I promise you, Abigail. We will find your mother." He reached for his phone. He had a private security team on retainer, a group of highly efficient, discreet men who could solve any problem money could buy. He had used them to handle corporate espionage, to vet business partners, to protect his assets. Now, he would use them to find a missing maid. As he made the call, he looked at Abigail. She was watching him, her blue eyes wide with a fragile, tentative hope. He saw her clutching something inside the pocket of the coat he had given her. It was a small, folded piece of paper. After he hung up the phone, having set in motion a search that would comb the city, he asked, "What do you have there?" Abigail hesitated, then slowly pulled the paper from her pocket. She unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph, worn and creased at the edges. It showed a young man in a crisp army uniform, a wide, confident smile on his face. He had the same bright blue eyes as Abigail. "It's my Grandpa Joe," she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "My mom says he was a hero. He fought in a war a long time ago. She said he was the bravest man she ever knew." James took the photograph. His hand trembled slightly as he looked at the smiling face of the young soldier. The name, the eyes, the timeline. It couldn't be, but it was. The world suddenly tilted on its axis. He knew this man. He had served with this man, Joseph Joe Patterson, a boy from Brooklyn who had saved his life in a forgotten jungle half a world away, all those years ago. A man he had lost track of after the war, a friend he had failed to keep. He looked from the fading photograph to the face of the little girl before him. The daughter of his housekeeper was the great-granddaughter of the man who had saved his life. A man he owed a debt he could never repay. The night was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about a promise made in the shadow of war, a debt of honor left unpaid for 50 years. And James Harrison knew, with a chilling, gut-wrenching clarity, that his carefully constructed, empty life was about to be turned inside out. The photograph felt heavy in James's hand, a relic from a lifetime ago. The face in the picture was young, full of the easy, unshakable confidence that belonged only to boys who hadn't yet seen the world's true face. Joe Patterson. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in half a century. It felt strange on his tongue, like a key to a door he had long since bricked over. He looked at Abigail, who was watching him with an unnerving stillness. Her blue eyes, so much like her great-grandfather's, seemed to see right through the layers of wealth and age to the young, terrified soldier he had once been. "Your great-grandfather," James started, his voice thick with emotion. He cleared his throat. He was a good man, a very brave man. Abigail's face brightened, a small, hopeful light in the sterile kitchen. "My mom says so too. She has his medal, the one they gave him for being brave. She keeps it in a special box." A medal. James knew which one she meant. It was the one he should have received. It was the one Joe had been given for pulling a wounded James out of a firefight, carrying him 2 miles through dense jungle to a medevac point, all while under enemy fire. James had been unconscious for most of it, but he remembered waking up to the deafening roar of a helicopter and seeing Joe's grimy, smiling face looking down at him. "Got you, Jimmy boy," Joe had said, before collapsing from exhaustion. "Told you I wouldn't leave you behind." James had been shipped home. He had recovered. He had inherited his father's business and turned it into an empire. Joe had finished his tour, and they had exchanged a few letters, but life, as it always does, had gotten in the way. James had gotten busy. The letters had stopped. The guilt had been a small, quiet thing at first, easily ignored. Over the years, it had faded into the background noise of his success, a forgotten debt. Until now. He handed the photograph back to Abigail. "We will find your mother," he said again. And this time, it was not just a promise to a child. It was a promise to the ghost of the man in the picture. The doorbell chimed, a soft, electronic sound that echoed in the vast apartment. James knew it would be his head of security. He placed a hand gently on Abigail's shoulder. "You must be exhausted. Let's find you a place to rest." He led her out of the kitchen and down a long, white hallway lined with abstract art that was worth more than the building Eleanor and Abigail lived in. He opened the door to one of the guest suites. There were 5 of them, all decorated with the same impersonal luxury, all of them perpetually empty. The room was larger than Abigail's entire apartment. A king-sized bed with a mountain of white pillows sat in the center. A wall of glass offered another stunning view of the city. Abigail hesitated at the doorway, as if afraid to step inside. "This will be your room for tonight," James said. "The bathroom is through there. There are fresh towels. I will find you something more comfortable to sleep in." He went to his own cavernous closet and pulled out a plain cotton t-shirt. It would be a nightgown on her. When he returned, she was standing exactly where he had left her, a tiny, lost figure in the opulent room. He handed her the shirt. "Get some rest," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible. "I will be right outside. I will wake you up the moment we have news of your mother." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You promise?" "I promise," he said, and he meant it more than anything he had said in years. He closed the door gently behind him and walked back to the main living area. A man in a sharp, dark suit was waiting for him. This was David Chun, the head of Harrison Global Security. David was a former federal agent, a man of quiet competence and unshakable calm. He had handled kidnappings, corporate threats, and a dozen other crises for James over the years. Finding a missing housekeeper should be simple. But James knew, deep down, that this was anything but simple. "Sir," David said with a respectful nod, "you have a situation." It was not a question. "My housekeeper, Eleanor Riggs, is missing," James stated, getting straight to the point. Her 10-year-old daughter, Abigail, was found alone. "I want you to find her, David. I want you to use every resource we have." David was already tapping on a tablet he had pulled from his briefcase. "I have her details from your HR files. We're already tracking her phone, but it appears to be off or the battery is dead. Last ping was near her apartment building 6 hours ago. I have a team heading to the diner she works at, another to the office building she cleans downtown. We're pulling security camera footage from all 3 locations and the surrounding areas." "Good," James said. He paced in front of the window, the city lights a dizzying blur below. Her landlord, Abigail, said he was a difficult man. Get a team to her apartment building. Talk to him. Talk to the neighbors. Someone must have seen something. "Already on it, sir," David replied, his fingers flying across the screen. "We're also checking local hospitals, police precincts, the usual protocol for a missing person." James stopped pacing and turned to face him. "This is not a usual situation, David. I want this handled with the utmost urgency. Money is no object. I want hourly updates. I want her found." David looked up from his tablet, a flicker of surprise in his professional gaze. He was used to Mr. Harrison being detached, clinical. This level of personal investment was new. "Understood, sir. We'll find her." As David left to coordinate the search from his own vehicle, James was left alone once more in the silence of his penthouse. He walked over to the grand piano that sat in the corner of the room, a magnificent instrument he hadn't played in years. He ran his fingers over the cool ivory keys, the notes hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. His mind drifted back again, to the humid jungles, to the sound of gunfire and the smell of fear. He remembered Joe Patterson, not just as a hero, but as a friend. Joe was the one who told jokes when everyone else was silent with terror. He was the one who shared his rations, who talked about his girl back home, a pretty girl named Mary who would later become his wife, Eleanor's grandmother. He had talked about the future, about opening a small auto shop, about having a family. Simple dreams. Honest dreams. What had happened to those dreams? How had Joe's lineage led to his great-granddaughter sleeping on a bus stop bench? Where had life gone so wrong for them? And what was his own role in it? He had built an empire on the foundation of a life that Joe had saved, and he had never once looked back to see what had become of his savior. A wave of shame washed over him, so potent it made him feel weak. He had become a man who saw people as assets or liabilities, employees or competitors. He had forgotten how to see them as just people. People with families, with struggles, with dreams of their own. He walked back to the guest room and pressed his ear to the door. He could hear nothing. He hoped Abigail was sleeping. He hoped that for a few hours, at least, she could find some peace in the eye of the storm. He felt a fierce, protective urge toward her. She was not just his housekeeper's daughter anymore. She was Joe Patterson's family. And in a way, that made her his family, too. He settled into an armchair in the hallway, a silent guardian outside her door. The city lights below seemed to mock him, a glittering testament to a success that suddenly felt hollow. He had all the power and money in the world, but he had failed at the one thing that truly mattered: basic human connection. An hour later, his phone buzzed. It was David. "We have something, sir," David said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We pulled the security footage from outside Eleanor's apartment building. She never made it home after her shift here. But we saw something else. A car. It was parked across the street all afternoon. A black sedan, no plates. We saw her leave your building on the public street cams. The car was half a block behind her bus. It followed her all the way to her stop." A cold dread crept up James's spine. This was not a simple case of a woman getting held up at work or having an accident. This was something else. "What happened at the bus stop?" James asked, his voice low. "That's the problem, sir," David said. "The camera at that intersection is malfunctioning. We have footage of her getting off the bus. The black sedan pulls up to the curb just out of frame. And then nothing. The next bus comes and goes. She's gone. The car is gone." James's mind raced. This was planned. Calculated. Someone had taken her. But why? Eleanor was a housekeeper. She had no money, no enemies that he knew of. It made no sense. Unless it wasn't about her at all. Was it about him? He was James Harrison, a man with a net worth in the billions. A man with rivals. Enemies. People who would do anything to get to him. Had someone taken his housekeeper to get to him? It was a chilling thought. His life of insulated, protected wealth had just been breached in the most personal way imaginable. He looked at the closed door of the guest room. Behind it, a little girl slept, oblivious to the fact that her world had been turned upside down, possibly because of the very man who was now vowing to protect her. "Find that car, David," James said, his voice hard as steel. "I don't care what it takes. I want to know who was in it. And I want to know where they took her." He hung up the phone. The silence of the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. He was no longer just a billionaire in his ivory tower. He was a man with a debt to pay and a little girl to protect. The long night was just beginning. The hours that followed were the longest of James Harrison's life. He sat in the armchair outside Abigail's room, a statue carved from anxiety. Sleep was a distant country he had no passport for. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, was the sound of a threat drawing closer. He had lived his life in a fortress of wealth, believing himself untouchable. Now, he understood that his fortress had been built of glass, and the world had just thrown a stone. He thought about Eleanor. He tried to conjure a clear image of her face, but all he could summon was a polite, deferential blur. A woman who called him Mr. Harrison, who kept his sterile home immaculate, who existed only in the periphery of his vision. He had never once asked her about her life, her struggles, her daughter. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. He had treated her as a function, not a person. And now, she was in danger, possibly because of him. Around 3 a.m., the door to the guest room creaked open. Abigail stood in the doorway, a small silhouette against the soft light from within. The oversized t-shirt hung to her knees. "I can't sleep," she whispered, her voice small. James's heart ached for her. He stood up, the joints in his knees protesting. "I'm not very tired either," he admitted. She clutched a corner of the t-shirt. Can I wait with you?" "Of course," he said immediately. She padded over to the armchair opposite his and curled up in it, tucking her feet underneath her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat in the quiet hallway, two strangers bound by a crisis, watching the city sleep below. "My mom sings to me when I can't sleep," Abigail said softly, her voice barely disturbing the silence. "She sings old songs, the ones her grandma taught her. She says they're full of stories." "Your great-grandmother, Mary?" James asked, remembering the name Joe used to speak with such reverence. Abigail nodded. She said Grandpa Joe loved to hear her sing. He said it was the prettiest sound in the world. A fresh wave of guilt washed over James. He had never known what happened to Mary. He had never asked. He had let the threads of his past unravel, never thinking to hold on to them. "Tell me about your mother," James said, wanting, needing, to know more about the woman he had so thoroughly overlooked. Abigail's face softened. "She's the best mom. She works really hard, but she's never too tired to read me a story. We have a rule. No matter what, we always have dinner together. Even if it's just sandwiches. She says it's our special time." A tear traced a path down her cheek. "We were supposed to have spaghetti tonight." The simple, domestic detail was more devastating than any grand tragedy. Spaghetti, a mother and daughter's special time. A small, ordinary ritual of love that had been stolen from them. "She sounds like a wonderful woman," James said, his voice husky. "She is," Abigail said fiercely, as if defending her mother from an unspoken accusation. "She's strong. Like Grandpa Joe. She says we have Patterson blood, and Pattersons don't give up." Pattersons don't give up. The words echoed in the chambers of James's heart. Joe hadn't given up on him in that jungle. He couldn't give up on Eleanor and Abigail now. His phone vibrated, a sharp, urgent buzz that cut through the quiet. He looked at the screen. It was David. He answered, his hand tight around the phone. "We found the car," David said, his voice clipped and professional. "It was abandoned in an industrial park in Queens. Wiped clean. But my people are thorough. They found something. A single cufflink, wedged under the passenger seat." "A cufflink?" James asked, confused. "It's custom-made," David explained. "Gold, with an onyx inlay. We traced the maker. He only made 10 pairs. They were commissioned as gifts for the board members of a rival company, Sterling Enterprises." The name hit James like a physical blow. Sterling Enterprises. His most ruthless competitor, run by a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a corporate predator, a man known for his hostile takeovers and his complete lack of ethics. They had been locked in a bitter struggle for a multi-billion-dollar government contract for the past 6 months. James had been winning. Marcus Thorne. James breathed, the name tasting like poison. "It seems likely, sir," David said. "Taking your housekeeper would be a message. A very personal, very ugly message. It's a way to distract you, to destabilize you before the final bids are due next week." James's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a strategic move in a corporate war. Marcus Thorne had taken a human being, a mother, a daughter of a hero, and turned her into a pawn. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was staggering. He looked at Abigail, who had fallen into a light, uneasy sleep in the chair, her face still streaked with tear tracks. Thorne hadn't just taken an employee. He had taken this little girl's entire world. A new kind of anger ignited within James. It was not the cold, calculated anger of a boardroom battle. It was hot, righteous, and deeply personal. Marcus Thorne had crossed a line that James himself had only just learned existed. He had trespassed on sacred ground. "Where is Thorne now?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He's at his estate in Connecticut," David replied. "He hosts a poker game there every week. High stakes. A lot of powerful people. Get me everything you have on that estate," James commanded. "Blueprints, security schematics, staff lists. Everything. And get a team ready. We're not waiting for the police to untangle this with red tape. We are going to get her back." "Sir," David said, a note of caution in his voice. "A direct action against Thorne is risky. The fallout could be." "I am well aware of the risks, David." James cut him off, his voice like ice. "Marcus Thorne wanted my attention. He has it. Now, he is going to learn what happens when you threaten the family of a man who saved my life." He ended the call. The die was cast. He was no longer just a billionaire protecting his assets. He was a man on a mission, fueled by a half-century of guilt and a newfound sense of duty. He looked out the window at the first faint hints of dawn painting the eastern sky. The night was ending, but the battle was just beginning. He walked over to the sleeping child and gently brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead. "I'm coming, Eleanor," he whispered into the quiet of the room. "I'm coming." He then gently scooped Abigail up in his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, nestling her head against his shoulder. He carried her back to the guest bed and tucked her in, pulling the soft, warm covers up to her chin. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her sleep. This child, this legacy of a forgotten hero, had done what no one else could. She had reminded him how to be human, and for her, he would be willing to tear the world apart. The plan came together with the cold, brutal efficiency of a military operation. David Chun, working from a secure van parked a block away from the penthouse, became the nerve center. He fed James a constant stream of information. Blueprints of Thorne's sprawling Connecticut estate, thermal imaging showing the number and location of guards, and a detailed dossier on Marcus Thorne himself, a man whose ruthlessness was matched only by his arrogance. James, for his part, felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in decades. The fog of his detached, emotionless life had burned away, replaced by a singular, unshakable purpose. He was no longer a CEO managing a crisis. He was a commander preparing for battle. The young soldier he had been, the one who had survived the jungle alongside Joe Patterson, was reawakening. He made one call, to a man he hadn't spoken to in 30 years. A man named Frank Kowalski, who had been the third member of their fire team back in the war. Frank had gone on to have a decorated career in special forces before retiring to a quiet life in the mountains. He was a man who understood loyalty and debt. "Frank," James said when the old soldier answered. "It's Jimmy Harrison." There was a pause on the line, then a gruff, surprised laugh. "Jimmy boy? I'll be damned. I thought you'd be too busy counting your money to call an old grunt like me." "I need a favor, Frank," James said, cutting to the chase. "A big one. It's about Joe Patterson." He explained the situation in clipped, concise sentences. He didn't have to embellish. The bare facts were enough. When he was finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That son of a," Frank finally growled. "Some things never change. Men like that, they think the world is their playground. They think they can just take what they want." He paused. "Joe's great-granddaughter, you say?" "Yes," James confirmed. "She's here with me. She's safe. But her mother—" "I'm in," Frank said without hesitation. "You tell me what you need." With Frank on board, the plan solidified. He would be the on-the-ground lead, directing a small, hand-picked team of his most trusted former operatives, men who, like him, lived by an older code of honor. They wouldn't be mercenaries for hire. They would be soldiers on a mission for one of their own. James looked in on Abigail one last time before he left. She was still sleeping soundly, a picture of innocence in a world that was anything but. He left a note for her on the bedside table, in case she woke up. "I have gone to bring your mother home. I will be back soon. I promise." He signed it simply James. He met David in the basement garage. A nondescript black van was waiting. Inside, it was a mobile command center filled with screens displaying feeds from drones that were already circling high above Thorne's estate. Frank and his three-man team were on a video link, their faces grim and determined. Thorne's poker game is in the West Wing, David reported, pointing to a highlighted section of the estate's blueprint. Eleanor is likely being held somewhere more secure. We've identified a safe room in the sub-basement. It's the most logical place. The guards? James asked. 10 on the perimeter, Frank answered, his voice crackling over the comms. Another 4 inside. Private security. Ex-military, but sloppy. They're corporate bodyguards, not soldiers. They're used to looking tough, not fighting a real threat. The plan was simple, audacious, and incredibly dangerous. Frank's team would infiltrate the grounds, neutralizing the perimeter guards silently. David would simultaneously hack into and disable the estate's security systems. Once inside, they would move to the sub-basement, extract Eleanor, and be gone before Thorne and his high-rolling guests even knew what was happening. James's role was to be the distraction. He would not be sitting in a van. He would be walking into the lion's den. An hour later, James's Rolls-Royce pulled up to the gates of Marcus Thorne's ostentatious estate. He had called Thorne's chief of staff and announced that Mr. Harrison was coming to discuss an urgent, time-sensitive revision to their bid for the government contract. A revision that would be mutually beneficial. It was a bluff, but a good one. Thorne's greed would be his undoing. As the heavy iron gates swung open, James felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of rightness. For the first time in a very long time, he was doing something that mattered. He was escorted into a large, oak-paneled room where Thorne and 5 other men sat around a poker table littered with chips and half-empty glasses of whiskey. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of conversation. Marcus Thorne looked up, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He was a man in his late 50s, with a predatory glint in his eyes and a perfectly tailored suit. He thought he had already won. "James," Thorne said, his voice smooth as silk. "An unexpected pleasure. I was just telling my friends here that the winds of fortune seem to be blowing in my favor." James met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I am not here to play games, Marcus." He placed a small, simple object on the polished surface of the poker table. It was the custom-made cufflink David's team had found. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes flickered to the cufflink, and a flash of something, annoyance, perhaps even fear, crossed his face. He recovered quickly, but James had seen it. "I believe this belongs to you," James said, his voice low and even. "You seem to have misplaced it, along with something that belongs to me." The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden tension in the room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "I think you do," James replied, not raising his voice. He leaned forward slightly. "Let me be very clear, Marcus. This is not about a contract. This is not about money. You have taken a member of my staff, a mother. You have left her child alone and terrified. You have made a grave miscalculation. You thought you were dealing with a businessman. You are not. Tonight, you are dealing with a man who is calling in a debt." As he spoke, he could hear the faint, coordinated chatter in the tiny, invisible earpiece he was wearing. Frank's team was in position. David had control of the security system. The trap was set. Thorne let out a short, harsh laugh. "You have a lot of nerve, Harrison, walking in here, making accusations." He gestured to the 2 large bodyguards standing by the door. "You are in my house. You are in no position to make demands. Those men work for you because you pay them," James said calmly. "The men I have with me work with me because they believe in what we are doing." He straightened up. "You have 60 seconds to tell me where she is. After that, this conversation becomes much more unpleasant for you." Thorne's face hardened. The mask of civility was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "You are a fool, old man. You have nothing." 50 seconds, James said, his eyes never leaving Thorne's. From his earpiece, he heard Frank's calm voice. "We're in. Sub-basement door breached. We see her. She's alone. Unharmed." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over James. She was safe. Now, all that was left was to close the net. 40 seconds, James said. Thorne signaled to his guards. "Show Mr. Harrison out. He seems to have lost his way." The 2 bodyguards started to move forward. At the same moment, all the lights in the estate went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. There were shouts of surprise and confusion from the men at the table. In his earpiece, James heard David's voice. "Lights out. Go time." And then Frank's. "We have her." Moving to extraction point. In the darkness, James smiled. He could hear the sounds of a brief, efficient scuffle as Thorne's bodyguards were neutralized by two of Frank's men who had slipped into the room under the cover of the blackout. When the emergency lights flickered on a moment later, Thorne was alone at the table, his guests cowering in a corner. His two bodyguards were on the floor, unconscious. Two grim-faced men in dark tactical gear stood over them. Thorne stared at James, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "What is this? Who are you people?" James walked calmly to the door. "I told you, Marcus. I'm just a man calling in a debt." He paused in the doorway and looked back at his rival. "By the way, I'm withdrawing my bid for the government contract. After the authorities hear about the kidnapping you staged tonight, I imagine you will be in no position to bid on anything for a very long time." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Marcus Thorne to his ruin. He didn't look back. The past was behind him. The future was waiting. And for the first time in a long, long time, James Harrison felt like he was finally walking in the right direction. The ride back to Manhattan was a journey through a different kind of darkness. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Thorne had faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and an equally profound sense of peace. The city was beginning to stir, its early risers chasing the first rays of a sun that had not yet broken the horizon. James watched the world wake up, feeling as if he were waking up with it after a long and troubled sleep. He rode in the back of the command van with David. The silence between them was comfortable, the silence of men who had just navigated a storm and reached the other side. Frank's team, with Eleanor, was in a separate vehicle just behind them. "She's doing okay," David said, sensing James's unspoken question. "Shaken, obviously, but she's strong." Frank said she didn't say much at first, just kept asking if her daughter was safe. "Did she say what happened?" James asked, his gaze fixed on the unfolding dawn. "Thorne's men grabbed her at the bus stop. They told her it was about you, that if she cooperated, she and her daughter wouldn't be harmed. They took her phone, put a bag over her head, and drove her to the estate. They put her in that room and left her there. She said the worst part was not knowing what was happening to Abigail." James closed his eyes. The calculated cruelty of it was still shocking. To use a mother's love for her child as a weapon, it was a level of depravity he had only ever read about. "Thorne?" James asked. "The local police are on their way to the estate. An anonymous tip," David said with a slight smile. "They'll find him, his guests, his unconscious bodyguards, and a story that will fall apart under the slightest scrutiny. His reputation will be in ashes by noon. The authorities will handle the rest." James nodded. He had no interest in Thorne's fate. His world had narrowed, focusing entirely on the two vehicles speeding toward the city, carrying a mother back to her child. He thought about the promise he had made to Abigail. "I have gone to bring your mother home." He had kept his word. It was a novel feeling, this sense of personal, moral accomplishment. It felt better than closing any multi-billion-dollar deal. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Frank's van was already waiting in the private underground garage. The back door slid open, and a woman emerged. She was tall and slender, with the same determined chin as her daughter and tired, fearful eyes that were scanning her surroundings frantically. This was Eleanor Riggs. Not the deferential, almost invisible employee, but a mother whose entire being was focused on one thing. Frank gave James a solemn nod. "She's all yours." Eleanor's eyes fell on James. There was confusion in them, and a million questions. But she asked only one. "My daughter? Is she?" "She is upstairs," James said, his voice gentle. "She's safe. She's been sleeping." The relief that washed over Eleanor's face was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It was the most beautiful thing James had ever seen. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She just nodded, her throat too tight for words. James led the way to the private elevator. The ride up was silent, charged with an almost unbearable emotional weight. Eleanor stood straight and still, her hands clenched at her sides, her entire body trembling with anticipation. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, the first light of morning was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, filling the vast space with a soft, hopeful glow. The apartment was quiet. James led Eleanor down the long hallway to the guest room. He stopped at the door and turned to her. "She's right in there." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a prayer. Then she turned, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. James remained in the hallway, feeling it was a sacred space he had no right to enter. He could hear a soft gasp, then the sound of muffled footsteps on the thick carpet. "Mom," a small, sleepy voice asked. "Oh, baby." Eleanor sobbed, the sound raw and full of love. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm so sorry." James heard the rustle of bedsheets, and he pictured the scene in his mind, a mother wrapping her arms around her child, holding on as if she would never let go. He heard Abigail begin to cry, not tears of fear, but of pure, unadulterated relief. He slowly backed away from the door, giving them their moment. He walked into the main living area and stood before the great window, looking out at the city he had conquered, the city that had almost swallowed a little girl whole. He had always seen it as a landscape of assets and opportunities. Now he saw it as a collection of a million stories, a million families, a million mothers and daughters, just like Eleanor and Abigail. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Frank Kowalski standing beside him. The old soldier's face was etched with the lines of a hard life, but his eyes were clear. "You did a good thing, Jimmy boy," Frank said quietly. Joe would have been proud. James felt a lump form in his throat. "I should have found him years ago, Frank. I should have. I let him down." "The war, it changes a man," Frank said, his gaze distant. "We all came home different. We all lost track of people. The important thing isn't what you failed to do yesterday. It's what you do today. You honored him tonight. You honored his family. That's all that matters." Frank and his team left soon after, disappearing as quietly as they had arrived. David assured James that all loose ends would be tied up, and then he, too, was gone. James was alone again, but the silence of the penthouse no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. An hour later, Eleanor emerged from the guest room. Abigail was with her, her small hand clutching her mother's. The fear was gone from Abigail's eyes, replaced by a quiet, joyful serenity. She had her world back. Eleanor had composed herself. Her face was pale, and she looked exhausted, but she stood tall. She walked over to James. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice still shaky. I don't know what to say. I don't understand why you did all this. For me." James gestured to the sofa. "Please sit. Both of you." He sat in an armchair opposite them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn photograph of Joe Patterson. He handed it not to Eleanor, but to Abigail. "Abigail," he said, "you told me your great-grandfather was a hero. You were right. I knew him. He was my friend." Abigail's eyes widened. Eleanor looked at James, completely stunned. "You knew my great-grandfather?" "We served together," James explained. His voice was steady, but it cost him a great deal of effort to keep it that way. "A long time ago, there was a battle. I was wounded badly. I would have died there if it hadn't been for him. He risked his own life to save mine. He carried me through the jungle to safety." He looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze unflinching. "I owe your family a debt that can never truly be repaid. For 50 years, I have been a wealthy man, a successful man. But I have carried the shame of not knowing what became of my friend. I got busy, and I let life get in the way. I never looked back. I never tried to find him." Seeing Abigail on that bench, and then seeing this photograph, it was like a second chance. A chance to finally honor the man who gave me my life. Eleanor stared at him, speechless. She reached into the worn backpack that Abigail had kept with her, the one that now sat on the floor beside them. She pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. She opened it. Inside, resting on faded silk, was a distinguished service cross. "He told my grandmother it was just a piece of metal," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "He said the only thing that mattered was that he got his buddy home safe. He used to call him Jimmy Boy." The old nickname, spoken in this sterile, modern room, closed a circle of 50 years. Tears welled in James's eyes, and this time, he did not fight them. He came home and tried to build a life. Eleanor continued, her family's story pouring out of her. He opened a small garage, just like he always wanted. But he had nightmares from the war. He struggled. The business failed. He worked odd jobs the rest of his life, always providing, but never getting ahead. He died when my mom was just a teenager. My grandmother, Mary, she worked as a seamstress until the day she died. My own father left when I was a baby. It's just been me and my mom, and now, just me and Abigail. We're Pattersons. We don't give up. But it's been so hard. James listened, and every word was a stone laid upon his heart. The simple, hard life of the hero he had left behind. The generational struggle that had culminated in a 10-year-old girl sleeping on a bus stop bench. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about charity. This was about justice. It was about legacy. That is all going to change, James said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. Your struggles are over, Eleanor. He explained his plan. It wasn't just a job. He was establishing a charitable foundation, the Patterson Foundation, dedicated to supporting the families of veterans. And he wanted Eleanor to run it. She would have a real salary, a career, a purpose that would honor her great-grandfather's memory. He was giving her a new apartment in a safe building near a good school, all expenses paid. He was setting up an unbreakable trust for Abigail, one that would cover her education all the way through university and beyond. Eleanor was crying again, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of disbelief, of a lifetime of weight suddenly being lifted from her shoulders. I can't accept all that, she stammered. It's too much. It is not enough, James said quietly. It is a down payment on a debt. Your great-grandfather gave me my life. The least I can do is make sure his family has the life he always dreamed of for them. He looked at Abigail, who was watching him with her bright, blue Patterson eyes. And besides, he added, a genuine smile reaching his eyes for the first time in years. I have a feeling I'm going to need someone to teach me how to make hot chocolate that tastes like a hug. Abigail giggled, a pure, happy sound that echoed in the vast, silent penthouse. It was the sound of a new beginning. A few weeks later, James stood with Eleanor and Abigail on the balcony of their new apartment. It was a bright, spacious home with a small terrace filled with flowers. Below them, a park buzzed with the laughter of children. Abigail was no longer a pale, frightened child. She was radiant, chattering excitedly about her new school and the friends she was making. Eleanor was transformed. The weary, worried lines on her face had softened. She carried herself with a new confidence, a new hope. She was already throwing herself into her work at the foundation, finding a passion she never knew she had. James was a regular visitor. He was no longer Mr. Harrison, the distant, formidable billionaire. He was James. He was the man who told Abigail stories about her great-grandfather, the brave, funny young soldier who loved to hear his girls sing. He was the man who was finally learning the names of the people who inhabited his world. He had learned that a legacy is not what you leave behind in stocks and buildings. It is what you build in the lives of others. In saving Eleanor and Abigail, he had, in the end, saved himself. He had found a family. He had paid his debt. He had finally come home from the war. Abigail ran over and hugged his leg. Thank you for finding my mom, James. He placed a hand on her blonde hair, his heart full. No, Abigail, he said softly, looking from the child to her mother, and then to the endless sky. Thank you for finding me. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.